right. Hi, I'm Squirrel Eiserloh. Thanks for coming to this. Power of Procedural Recipes. This is going to be the first of 6 talks this afternoon about procedural stuff. My quick background, I'm a game designer / programmer. I've been coding since 1980. My background in undergrad degree is physics. I've been doing this professionally for a long time. It's my 13th year talking at GDC. And my current day job is to teach grad school students video game development. Worked at these companies as a technical director or a lead programmer at each of those companies, and I've worked with a lot of companies on a lot of games. So this afternoon, I want the sessions, hopefully they will be, to be connected, but each one its own individual thought. So they're all going to be related to procedural content generation, so hopefully that's something you're at least mildly interested in. But again, each one has its own central theme. I will not have any demos for this talk, but generally I have a bunch of different demos of 2D and 3D and various things that I'm going to be showing for a bunch of the talks. So if you like demos, you'll get some of that. So this is procedural recipes, which I'll explain here in a second. Then we'll have a 20-minute break and then 30-minute sessions. That's the pattern for the rest of the day. So I'm going to talk about humans and algorithms sort of collaborating. And then staged parametric generation, which is my sort of assertion that we shouldn't just make map generators or world generators. We should have mutators that sort of work together in combination. And I'm going to talk about Perlin worms and some other variations like that for creepy crawling stuff like rivers and roads and canyons across terrain. At 4:40, I'll talk about some of the problems endemic to having a ridiculously large or infinite world and how that's in some ways fundamentally different than having a medium-sized or finite world, and the differences in the problem spaces and how to solve some of them. And then we'll wrap up with probably the most hippie Zen talk, which is trying to bring some more flavor and life into procedural content generation using metadata, and I'll explain what I mean by that. Okay, so power of procedural recipes. I want to talk about first principles, where we're coming from. I want to talk about the problem space. I want to talk about what I mean by recipes, and then recipe books, and then I want to revisit the problem space and talk briefly at the end about the cost of failure. So first principles. Hopefully you at least accept the idea that procedural generation is useful or even good, not just for generating terrain, but that's one of the cool things it can do, obviously. I think one of my most important first principles here is that the game designer is the bottom line of the design chain. The game programmer is the bottom line of the design chain. So when the design team says that this piece of armor halves the damage you receive from something, or it doubles your speed, and this other piece of armor also halves it or doubles something, does that mean it's quartered or 1/3? Right? If things stack, are they multiplicative or additive? There's 1,000 little details that are going to be in your hands, whether you want to be the designer or not. So design often don't have as strong of a math background as well, so it's also going to be your job to ask good questions of them and help them work through some of those things. So really the game programmer is where the design rubber meets the road. Obviously having the right job makes the right tool makes the job easier. I've been rebuilding my back porch on my house, and I've been using this saw, the circular saw, and I finally just got one of these miter saws, and now I'm just shwump, chopping boards 3 seconds each, and it's 100 times easier to do the job. Those tools today are going to include a good random number generator. If you don't know what I mean by that, I have opinions. I talked about them last year. You can find that on YouTube. It should be good and fast and lightweight. It should be seedable, so you can set a seed, and then you should be able to get a consistent sequence of numbers out of that. It should be multiple instantiable. You should be able to have one that's feeding you numbers for your particles, while another one is feeding you numbers for your characters, and they don't pollute each other. It needs to be ideally random, out of order accessible, meaning you should be able to jump forward in the random sequence of numbers or jump back, right, which something like Rand or even Mersenne Twister can't do. We're going to use Perlin noise. Hopefully you're at least vaguely aware of that or familiar with it. And some easing functions. And if you're not up on any of these, you should be fine to survive these talks today. But I do have talks from this tutorial from 2014, 2015, 2017 that address all of those if you want some background information. Okay, understanding your problem space is key. A lot of times when you're especially working in procedural content, you can find yourself knee-deep in the problem space, and you don't even really understand the problem space, and you're so worried about the code of it that you're sort of losing sight of the big picture. And that's easily leads us to problems of scale and other problems that we'll talk about. So having that bird's eye view is really important to keep your eyes on the prize and choose the right battles. All right, so the problem space. What does the problem space for procedural content generation look like? Your PCG may be in danger of being boring, repetitive, misordered, inappropriate, or invalid. Let's take boring first. This is the toughest problem, but it's also, I think, for me, the most fun, is just like making things cooler and cooler. We can help with that. I'll talk a little bit more about that today. Another problem is repetition, right? If I have two things that are very similar, they're kind of samey and boring. There's actually three ways, I think, of being repetitive with procedural content. The first one is similarity. Just, yep, there's another sine wave looking mountain, just like the previous sine wave looking mountain that you had. So it's not the same, it's not exactly the same, but it's not interestingly, distinctly different, right? So just sameness, right? There's also coincidental twins, right? You could roll some dice, pull some letters out of the alphabet, and come up with the name John Macbeth, and then you might roll some different dice and happen to come up with John Macbeth also, right? Or roll a die for hair color and for gender and clothing, and then look, you have two NPCs that look alike, even though they're not the same person. And then the most insidious of these is what I call seed echoes. So let me explain what that means. So let's say I have 3 random seeds, and each one of those is going to be used to generate a world. And then those seeds are going to, when I'm generating those worlds based on those seeds, they're going to come up with new seeds with which to generate the towns that are on those worlds. And then those are used to come up with seeds that generate the villagers within the towns, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we have some problems here. First, I want to point out the number 37 as a seed came up 3 times. This is not a problem, right? Using 37 to generate a planet has nothing to do with using 37 to generate a town or 37 to generate a person. So this is a non-issue. The issue is when we get seed number 33 to generate a person, his personality, his demeanor, his physical characteristics, and we happen to pull that same 33 in 2 different villages on other sides of the world, or even on 2 different worlds. And now if the player's unlucky, she comes across this identical person, and hey, wait, there's this weird uncanny coincidence. I thought I met this person before. Far worse than that is a deep seed echo, right? If I happen to generate town 54 on planet Earth and also town 54 on planet Jupiter, maybe I arrived at those different ways, I modded by a different number, but I ended up with 54. Everything about the town, every person in the town is going to be identical. That's a real problem. I call that a deep seed echo. All right. That's repetition. Misordering. We might unveil procedural content in a nonsensical order. A lot of times it's kind of this ungoverned thing and you just get thrown in the deep end of it, right? We might have a resolution to some problem before we present the tension of that problem. Or we might present the door before we've exposed you to the key. Or we might give you the harder puzzles before the easier ones, right? If they're just randomly generated, who's to say which one's harder and which one's easier? And you're going to get some hard ones before easy ones. We could have inappropriateness. Did your PCG do something inappropriate? Did it say something that makes no sense? It put fish in the desert. Worse yet, did it make something obscene, right? How are you going to stop against that? A big problem is invalidity, right? Are you generating things that are just simply broken? And how often does that happen? It's okay. There are ways around this. We'll talk about some of them right now. Maybe you can generate content that's always good. That's great. Maybe you have content that's 90% of the time it's good, but occasionally you get a broken thing, right? A level that can't complete all the way through, or a puzzle that's unsolvable. Maybe it's frequently bad or usually bad, but occasionally good, or maybe your content is never valid. And that's actually fine. There are perfectly valid processes that start with invalid data and then try to work from there. So how do you make sure things you generate are valid? I personally know of 5 ways, at least I have when I've been thinking about all this talk. The first way, obviously, is just to not fail. Just make your content always be valid. And some problems, you can do that. You can write generators that just always generate good content, right? If I make a name generator that takes random letters from the alphabet, I'm going to get some garbage names. But if I take ones that only just pick from a list of legit names, well, then I'll only get legit names. Or maybe even I only pick certain syllables that only go with other syllables, and I know it will always produce safe content, right? There are other ways of dealing with this. One I call a recursive rewind is, like, let's say you're laying out rooms, and then you throw out tunnels from those rooms, and then they connect to other rooms, and then, oh crap, that tunnel we just made overlaps that room we have. That can't work. Okay, let's back up, and then let's throw out a different tunnel and see if we go from there. So we can, like, unwind until we try again and hopefully find something that's good. Another way is to massage and iterate. This is one of those techniques that works when your initial generation is always invalid. For example, I just throw a bunch of random points at the screen for the placement of stars in my star system. And then I use some basically physics springs to say sort of, hey, everyone push off of each other for 100 frames until you're sort of stable. So I just like throw you down and then have you fix yourselves, massage and iterate yourself out of the problem. Of course, another way is just generate something, and if it's bad, throw it away and generate it again. Keep trying until you get something good. That works if you can generate pretty quickly, and also if your rate of success is reasonably high, right? If it takes you 3 seconds to generate something, or even half a second, and you have to have 100 tries, that may not be a real-time solution. And lastly, today's topic, procedural recipes. All right, so what do I mean by recipes? The basic idea is this. Pick what you want to generate. I want to generate a 5x5 puzzle with these elements in it, or I want to generate a town, and the random seed you're going to use. Basically, all the information you need to generate that thing. Go ahead and generate it. Then evaluate that content. Is it valid? Is it good? So there's a lot of subtlety in this step. A human can evaluate it, look at, that map is boring, or no, that looks broken to me. But that's not really scalable, right? So what I'm really talking about is some sort of automated validation, right? When you generate your roguelike dungeon, you have stairs up and stairs down. Run a quick A-star path to make sure you can path through the map that it connects through. Or do a flood fill to make sure that you can reach all the parts of the level that you want to be able to reach. There's a bunch of other ways of validating content. Another thing we'll do here is we've generated the content, we evaluate it, and we say, yes, it's good, it's valid. And we also, while we have it generated, like we've actually generated the map or the town or the puzzle to look at it, hey, while we're here, let's take some notes, right? Oh, that's interesting. I see that this village ends up spanning both sides of a river. Okay, note that. If the content's valid, you write out its recipe. So the recipe officially then is the inputs you needed to generate it, and then some notes about what was generated. Then you throw it away. So now all you're left with is this tiny little recipe that's like a little receipt that says, hey, I know that you can generate this thing and it will be valid. Oh, and by the way, there's a redhead named Joseph and he sells something in the town. You don't even have to have Joseph in memory. You can just have a note that there will be a Joseph. All right, so some examples of recipes. Inputs, seed 31. What am I generating? A village, and I'm doing it in a swamp. I generate the village, I count the number of houses. Oh, interesting, there were 19 houses. There ended up being a population of 35, and there was no temple. I write that down, I throw away the content, and I just keep this tiny flyweight receipt of there is a village, and I can generate it every time I want to, and I know exactly what will be in it. Same, seed number 57, a village in a swamp. This one has more houses, more population, 59, also has a temple. And maybe if these are the only 3 seeds in my recipe book, which we'll talk about in a minute, then maybe that implies that seeds 0 through 30 were bad, right? And 58 was bad. So we only wrote down the valid ones. There's no limit on what you can write down in terms of the metadata. For example, this village, I generated its name. It was the village of Hamlet. It has a size of 64 by 36. And I rolled a seed to see whether or not there would be a temple. And let's say I say 0 means there is no temple. Whether there's a blacksmith and whether there's a wizard. So now I know there is no temple, there's no blacksmith, and there is a wizard, and by the way, his seed is 42. So if you ever need to know anything about him, you can just generate him in a vacuum and see, oh, what would his name have been, will be, without even having the town instantiated. I could have a planet. Its name is Romulus. It's an oceanic terrestrial planet with 32% titanium, 11% tungsten, 27% palladium. Throw the planet away. So recipe metadata can include just about anything you want to know about the content you used to generate that you want to know at a glance. For example, if I'm looking at houses, I sort of see the recipes to the houses. It's a house, it's 2,200 square feet, it's in Carrollton, Texas, and it's 4-bedroom, 2-bath, right? That's kind of the recipe level of information. I can also generate names. It's kind of a nice thing to store. For example, I may want to know the name of the mayor of the town. I may want to write that down and then throw it away. So I can even have the dynamic procedural narrative weave his name into the dialogue even though he doesn't even exist. And technically, maybe he never existed, which I'll get to in a second. You can also note any interesting key features, right? Like the location, or a volcano is nearby, or there's a palace in it, or there's a capital, or this town contains a jail, anything of note. If it's got a difficulty rating, like a dungeon or a puzzle, you could note how hard it is, how many levels is it, what kind of bad guys are in there. And if there are any prerequisites, let's say you randomly generate that there's a green door, you could make a note, hey, it's not ruined, it's just you can't go in here until you have a green door. So now if you have door key logic, you can say, I need to have a dungeon where you get a green key before I throw this dungeon at you where you need to use the green key. That's all I need to know about them. They don't need to know more. I think there's 2 kinds of recipes in general. First, post-generation recipes is what I've been talking about mostly here. And there's also pre-generation recipes. These are my terms, even recipe, so I don't know if there's any other better term for this. A post-generation recipe is, like I've been saying, you pick your seed, you pick your constraints, and you generate your content fully, completely. You have the village in memory with all the people and all their cats and dogs and their swords that they're selling at the store. You observe it, analyze it, make notes, and then you discard the content, right? Just like I said. Pre-generation recipes is a slightly different twist on it, where you start by, maybe you generate the planet, right? And then that generates the 6 cities, and then you start by generating the city names, and then you just stop right there. Okay, that's all I need to know. It's a gaseous planet where there's 6 floating cities, and here are their names. Boom. I don't need to go fully instantiate all of the procedural content just to make my notes. So the post-generation recipes, once I've written them down, effectively are a foolproof way for me to be able to predict what will be generated the next time I pull that seed up, right? When I do really generate it in the game for real. And the pre-generation recipes are good enough to like just a quick peek into some neighboring content. So I'm on a planet, there's another planet nearby. What's that planet's name? It's Vulcan. Okay, cool, that's the planet Vulcan. I didn't need to know everything about that planet, but I can ask the questions and get quick answers. Most importantly, recipes are flyweight, tiny, right? You can, in theory, they could be as small as a seed. That's it. They could be a seed in a difficulty. They could be any number of things. Most importantly, however, recipes can be generated offline prior to shipping. So if you have some content that takes hours to generate, or probably if it's hours to generate, then your player won't be able to do it. But maybe it takes hours to generate. Oh, I finally found one that's valid, right? If you have a 1 in a million chance. I shipped a puzzle game that used all this methodology, and we had 42 different types of puzzles, and on the very final type of puzzle, I think we only had 1 in 200,000 attempts was a valid puzzle, because the puzzles were so complex. So we had to let it run all night for 8 hours just to come up with 50 valid puzzles. Okay, recipe books are just a collection of recipes, but you might have multiple different ones, and there are different kinds that serve different purposes. The first one, probably the most common and simple, is what I'd call a vetted list or a white list. And I'll talk about each of these briefly. There's a seed remap list or a black list. There's sorted lists and already seen lists, and there can be any number of these. So a white list would be the list of recipes, which again, at minimum, is going to contain the seeds that you know are valid because you've already checked that they're valid. For example, these are the recipes for the generated dungeons that were proven to be connected end to end. There could be recipes for puzzles that I know to be solvable, recipes for names that I know have passed all my obscenity filters, so I don't have to do that in real time. Recipes for generated villagers that were content unique, right? Like I could keep a list of the ones I've generated in the whitelist so far, and every time I generate someone else, if I'm doing this offline, I'm like, okay, he's valid, but let's just check he's not the same as any one of the previous ones we've already validated. So I could just throw him out if he's too similar. This is ideal when a low percentage of your content is valid, right? If it takes you 100 tries to do something, then the player doesn't have time to sit and let you generate 100 levels, but you sure do before you ship, right? And you're just going to write down the number 72, and then that's the only one they generate. A seed remap list or black list, kind of similar, but it's actually a list of seeds which are bad, or recipes really that are bad. And it's not just a blacklist, but it's a redirect list. Each recipe contains not only the bad seed, but also provides an alternative new seed to use instead, like a hash collision remap or whatever you call that. Right? So if I'm saying, okay, generate number 1 is cool, number 2 is cool, number 3 is cool, number 4 is bad, but I'll keep rolling, and then, I'll see number 16 is good. So I'll say, if you get a 4, use 16 instead. That's your sort of replacement seed number. And then that might be uniquely assigned to you. So anyone can use any seed. They look themselves up in the blacklist. If they exist, then they switch to the other seed that's validated instead. So you sort of automatically get a hit out of a miss. Use cases, you can list unsolvable puzzles, invalid maps, obscene names, repeated content, including coincidental content, similar content, or those deep or shallow seed echoes like we talked about. So these can solve that problem. This is ideal for when most of your content is good and you just need to write down, the 5 or 10 that are bad, or even the, 10 or 1,000 or 2,000 that are bad out of 1,000,000. So if most of your content's good, just write down the bad ones. If most of your content's bad, just write down the good ones. Sorted recipe lists. You could generate a bunch of things and then sort them by some of that metadata that you wrote. For example, you could generate a bajillion puzzles and then evaluate them for difficulty, which we did, and then sort them by difficulty. So now you have a perfect ramp from easy puzzles to medium to hard, just by surfing through the list that's sorted by difficulty rather than by seed. You could have a list of planets sorted by titanium, sorted by palladium, sorted by whatever, so sorted by size. So now if you want a big planet, boom, just go to the end of that big planet list. If you want a titanium poor planet, go to the beginning of that list. Dungeons sorted by monster level or by humidity. You're like, I need a really wet dungeon where my lizard folk and my goblins or my kobolds are going to be. Or I need a really arid dungeon because it takes place in the desert. This is ideal for easy to hard content progression. Like I said, you can sort by difficulty. It's great for in-game learning progression. You could sort by which mechanics are exposed. So if these first 27, if there are 27 of your 100 dungeons don't have the blankety blank mechanic, you could push those first before the ones that do, so that people sort of warm up to that, and then you're effectively deciding when to expose them to that new mechanic. It's great for content fishing. Give me an arid dungeon, give me a huge planet. You just go to the list, pull from where you want. There's already seen lists. This is more of a dynamic list at runtime of just whenever you generate something, you write it down. You make a note, oh look, I have shown the player this, I don't want to show her that again. So this could be at any level, right? Anytime you generate the name Susan Malkovich, you write that down and you just make sure you never give out the name Susan Malkovich again. No problem. If you have generated village number 57, you just don't ever generate village 57 again, right? You reject that. This could be anything that the player has actually seen, right? Because you're trying to not spoil repetition. You can reset this every time they start a new campaign, a new game, or you could even keep it across games so that even if I start a new game, I'll continue to see new content. This is ideal for eliminating content repeats. There's an alternative to this, which is just you take your other lists, like whitelists, and here's the list of all the puzzles I have that are valid, and then as I encounter them, I sort of cross them off the whitelist. So like that's no longer a valid puzzle for me to choose from. All right, so returning to the problem space. Remember that understanding your problem space is key here, right? So ask yourself these questions. What do you need? We're going to talk about this more in the last session today, but in general with PCG, it's very easy to get glitter lust, right? And think overly ambitious about what you want to accomplish. I could have all this stuff and it could do this and it could do this. But there's this sort of exponential difficulty and cost to some of those things. And so you have to be really careful about asking, what do you need? For example, do you need generative independence? If I generate A, then B, does that always have to be the same as if I generate B, then A? Meaning, is the order allowed to affect the generation? If yes or no, it depends. It affects some certain algorithms that we can use. So for example, let's say that I want to generate you, and if I happen to go to your town first, I roll some dice, and you are John Smith, and then I go to his town, and I roll some dice, and like, you're Joe Brown. But now if I had visited the towns in reverse order, he would have gotten John Smith, and then he would get stuck with Joe Brown. So there's a case where, depending on which techniques I'm using, I may or may not be able to guarantee order independence of generation. Don't need gameplay independence. So this could be I share a seed with my buddy. We're both going to play the same map together, but single player, separately maybe. So we play, but then his play style ends up affecting things differently than mine. So for example, if there's an AI director that detects, hey, you're playing really, really fast. I need to slow you down. Like my content pacing advisor is saying I need to slow you down. Then that director might throw up a wall in your place or throw some more monsters or have some pit appear right around the corner that you haven't quite seen yet. But they may not do that for me. And so if it's anything at all is dynamic based on our gameplay style, then that affects which algorithms we can use as well. Also ask yourself, what is your tolerance for repeats? And so are you okay with shallow echoes? Are you okay with two different people that happen to have the same name? That's not a big deal. That happens in real life. Are you okay with just that odd person that happens to be in 3 different villages? That's okay. Maybe. Are you okay with deep echoes? Entire villages? Probably not. Cave shapes? Yeah, maybe. If this one cave happens to appear on 2 planets, fine. So it really matters. What you're generating will determine your answers to these questions. We can prevent echoes with recipes if the entire space is known, or if we don't need to be generatively independent, right? As long as we say it's okay to cross off John Smith, and I'm okay with the second person getting the second name, then I can solve a lot of problems. If I can't say that, which we're going to talk about later, then I'm in trouble. Lastly, what's the cost of failure for each content flub, right? If your puzzles have no solution, game over. Game stopper, a bug. The person quits the game forever. Must fix. The map has no path to the exit, showstopper. What about names? The Kingdom of Gizwas. I mean, it's a B, C bug, right? I might fix it. It's kind of peculiar, funny. Kingdom of Penis. It's embarrassing. I probably won't go to jail for it. Kingdom of Shit. I probably don't want to have that in my E for Everyone game. King of dog poo, you can't really catch everything. The parting warning, beware of fragility. Everyone who's done procedural content or random generation knows even one roll of the die in the middle of a sequence can completely disrupt the sequence. You're probably already tasted that or familiar with that. So, butterfly effect number 1, do not disrupt your RNG sequence. If you have all your things rolling rand, a single particle can change the entire universe, right? Literally, I have a 60 frames a second in the main menu, which has particles flying, and you have 40 frames a second in the main menu. You generated different number of particles than me. We're gonna have different maps. So separate your random number generators, make sure the particles aren't eating numbers out of the villager sequence or something. Butterfly effect number 2, the player action can disrupt the random number generation. So as we pointed out with the names, well, we could do this with towns. If town 57 is going to be over here and over here, whoever gets it first is going to claim 57, and the other person's going to have to pick something else. So we could totally shuffle the puzzles, or the towns. And lastly, and most importantly, butterfly effect number 3. Even the tiniest algorithm change to your procedural generation content means all of your recipes are invalid. I learned this the hard way. So even something that says, well, there's just this, I added this one little line of code that says there's this 1% chance to add this thing. Like, you didn't just ruin 1% of your recipes, you ruined 100% of them. It means you're going to be rebuilding them. Thank you, guys.